Okay, so what should you expect from today's talk? First of all, we're going to dive into an overview of how we build product at Twitch, most specifically in the extensions org. Now, Twitch definitely has high-level concepts that we bring from Amazon, but each org differs a little bit in how it likes to approach product. And I'm sure folks at other companies will also have different ways of approaching it, but there's definitely some pretty strong tenets to align with. Next, what we're going to do is actually deep dive into each of those parts of the process, framed around a product that we shipped from early 2018 to early 2019, covering the initial inception strategy through product discovery, MVP, and GTM, as well as a number of iterations. The latter section is interesting because each iteration of the product came under very, very different circumstances. And hopefully this will be a good kind of case study for how you should approach the situation, or could, when you're building your own products. And the big thing here is going to be stories about what went well, but more importantly, there are going to be stories of what went bad. I find I learn the most when things go wrong, and I hope you can all learn from some of the really dumb things that I did, though hindsight is 20/20, and hopefully be the better for it. Okay, so let's look at the high-level product development process, and I'm kind of breaking it down into 4 broad sections, although we're going to delve into more details. The first one is what I like to call the working backwards section, and this really borrows from a concept that Amazon likes to drive called working backwards. What do you know? Here, the big goal is, first of all, really immersing yourself in the customer, understanding their needs, and gathering as much data as possible, both qualitative and quantitative, then coming together with your team to kind of create the multi-year vision of what the product is going to be. We'll dive into that. Next is a section called product discovery, where you come out of working backwards, you have a number of hypotheses about what you should build, but this section is about how do you validate those as quickly as you can before your engineers start writing code. One of my managers back at Microsoft once told me, engineers are your most precious resource, like don't waste them. And not to think of people as resources, but truly, engineers' time is super valuable, and your job as the product manager is to make sure that building the right thing that will have the most impact. Next, after that, we'll talk about MVP and GTM. So how do you determine your minimum viable product, and how do you actually bring it to market? And then finally, we'll dig into the section of iteration, which in my mind is really where your job as a product manager begins. Once your product is in market, how do you gather data, how do you iterate, and how do you actually go towards achieving the outcomes that you're trying to drive with customers? So, like I said, Twitch is a live streaming platform where broadcasters broadcast themselves playing a number of different video games as well as other kinds of content. Now, the thing that you should take away from this, though, is not necessarily the content that's being broadcasted, but the special part is the interaction between the broadcaster and their audience that's happening live and the community that forms around it. Now, originally, back when Twitch started, it was about live chat. That a broadcaster could be doing something, I could say something, and they could respond back to me, which is the magical bit. And then later in Twitch's history, it built things like subscriptions, being able to subscribe to a broadcaster's channel, or being able to cheer at a broadcaster. But for Twitch to grow and to really establish its strategic position, it needs to go beyond that. Now, if you go on Twitch, you'll probably see that there's a very, very diverse set of content and a diverse set of communities. And for Twitch to try to build all of this themselves, well, we don't have nearly enough engineers. We'd have to multiply that by like 100 at least to actually tackle these scenarios. And plus, for some communities, it wouldn't make sense for us to, put a bunch of effort around a community of, let's say, like 100,000 viewers. So this is where developer experience and extensions comes in. By enabling developers, or third-party developers specifically, a surface to build on the channel, over the video, or in panels, like this is like first-class real estate on the channel that the audience can interact with. We have not only, one, allowed folks to build content tailored to those individual communities, we've also enabled other folks to build a business on top of it. So extensions is very, very strategically important. And to give you a sense of what some extensions are, this example, I probably should have made this a GIF, but I'm a terrible person. So right here, this is the extension over the video, so it's actually a live app. And this one is from Twitch Prime, where it's pretty simple. It lets you know when your Prime subscription is ready to go. And it's great for broadcasters because it makes them money. And it also is great for viewers because it lets them know when they can do something high value on the channel. Another example is something here. This is a little quick screenshot of a extension called Deckmaster, and this is pretty magical. So when you're watching the game Hearthstone, unless you're already familiar with it, you might not know what's actually going on, or if a card gets played, you're like, okay, I see this thing, but I don't know what it does. The magic of Deckmaster actually lets you just mouse over the video as if it was just on your own screen. It will actually pop up information about what's being played. And it's really fun to see people's reactions the first time that they see this. It's like, wait, you can do that? Like, how does that work? But what I love is it's really improved the comprehension of the audience. It's given them context about what's happening. And if you actually look in chat, it will up-level the conversation. Not like, hey, what card was that? It's more like, oh my God, he did this. Like, well, what does that mean? Because again, it's all about establishing community. Now, another example that takes us even further is one called crowd control, which is a pretty simple one for kind of OG kind of games from Super Nintendo. And what this actually lets you do is, as the audience member, influence the gameplay as it's happening. So you have someone trying to speedrun through a game, and you can do all kinds of things like help them, hinder them, just nuke their health, drop bombs on them, all kinds of crazy stuff. And what's fun about this is it really enables distributed innovation. And like I mentioned before, you have extensions that live on the channel page, you have ones that live below, and really all over the place. It's a really powerful surface. But that being said, the channel page on Twitch, a lot of stuff's going on. It's very dynamic. There's all different kinds of users, different kinds of states, all different kinds of things you have to account for. And when you're trying to build something, it's a lot's going on. Now, I don't expect folks to dig into this slide too much, but basically, developers build this. They have to interface with a ton of different pieces from Twitch, and they have to build it at a pretty high scale. So there's a pretty high bar for them to be able to build this. And on our side, my focus is, well, how do I help them build the best possible experience? Because as a developer, like if I'm going to spend all this time and money, I want to make sure that I'm doing something that's going to have a return. I want to do something that's going to have high engagement. And I want to ship a polished experience. And with that, one of the products that we built, and one of the ones that we'll talk about for the scope of this, is something called the Developer Rig. The Developer Rig is a standalone tool that developers use as part of their extension development process. It lets you do a number of things, from creating your extension, going through the life cycle, and then actually testing it live across what I'll show you later is called the Brady Bunch view, across a bunch of different contexts all at the same time, and doing it dynamically. And the motivation behind all of this is, as a developer, I want to drive my iteration time down as much as possible, so I can spend as much time as possible building an awesome experience. So the talk's going to focus on this. What it looks like now is not what it looked like when it started, and I like it for a couple of reasons. One, it's a standalone product, so we can kind of really look at it in isolation, and also the fact that it has such a, I'll call it a torrid history over the last year, and there's some interesting things to talk about there. Seems good? Sweet. Okay, let's actually talk about developing products now. Working backwards. So in this phase, the desired outcome here is to really come away with a product vision that is over multiple years, that is centered around a customer, and then being able to have a strategy, a prioritization, and a set of metrics that you're trying to drive. So that way, as you're actually building the product and deciding what features you're going to add, you have a very, very strong framework in which to do it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, what you want to do at this phase is you want to immerse yourself with the customer as much as possible. This is including things like gathering qualitative data, doing customer interviews, understanding what their problems are, if possible, even like going through their lives. This came from Amazon, so originally it was about, hey, how do we build products to help sell people things? Like you think of something like the Amazon kind of easy button and where that came from, and that was literally talking to young families that are running all over the house in the morning and they're trying to remember what to do, and they just need an easy way to make sure that I get laundry detergent. And that's kind of where it came from. In this case, this would be interviewing developers to understand, like, hey, what are your pain points? What are you trying to do? What are you motivated by? Now, qualitative data is really important, but quantitative data is equally important. Especially if you're building a product that is on top of an existing business, you can often, for example, look at what is your user conversion funnel? Where are there leaks? Where are you having problems with retention? And it's looking at these places, that's where you can start finding opportunities to help. Once you've grounded yourself in data, now it's about bringing your team together. Like, this is not an exercise that a product manager should do by themselves. It's all about, how do I get my dev team? How do I get my marketing team? How do I get my design team together? And let's actually collectively brainstorm and figure out what we should be doing. Now, this isn't just a, hey, let's just write shit on the whiteboard. This is meant to be a very, very structured process so that it's very, very outcome driven. And the outcome of this is something called a PRFAQ. We love acronyms. What that really means is a document that starts with a PR statement. And you may have seen this from Amazon in the past, where it's all over the internet, but basically to pitch a new product, you actually have to write a press release of what the announcement of the product would be, or what someone would be writing about the product, let's say a year after its inception. And it's really, really cool because it really forces you to be user-oriented around the value that you're providing and be as specific as possible. The other piece, the FAQ, is a set of questions that you have to answer, or rather like a customer might ask you or an internal stakeholder might ask you. And the cool thing about this is by the time you're done, you usually have a pretty crisp view of what your vision is, and also you have this really great document that you can share across the company, which, believe me, is very, very useful. So let's kind of look at what those questions are. The first thing you want to ask is, who is the customer? And in this case, you could have multiple customers. You should think about, like, what are the different cohorts? Where do they come from? What's the demographic data that you might need to have about this? The next thing you have to ask is, what are their problems? And what are some opportunities that you might have? Again, being a product manager is centered around solving problems for customers and driving positive outcomes for them. And if you're not solving a problem, well, a customer is not going to use your product. The next thing you need to be thinking about is, well, how do we know this? Like how, we're starting to think that there are these problems. We have some hypotheses, but like how can we actually prove that? And this is where the qualitative and quantitative data that you gathered earlier is really, really important. The next thing to think about is, well, what would be the biggest benefit? Because again, as a product manager, your goal is to deliver the thing that will have the most impact to solve the problem for the customer. Oftentimes, there's a lot of ways to solve a problem, and part of your job is figuring out what we don't do. So that's very important. And then the last thing is, well, what does that customer experience look like? And then you actually write out the user journey, even if it's something that's not going to release for 2 years. Because what you're trying to create is this vision that you work backwards from to actually build your product roadmap. So let's talk about how this actually worked in practice when we were coming up with our vision the rig was a result of that. So on the extensions team, we had kind of 4 main quadrants, since it was a pretty big product area. We had the actual framework on the channel. We had the discovery experience, essentially our app store. We had someone focused on monetization. And then my goal was focused on what we called our developer experience. Basically, how do we get people to successfully build great extensions? So kind of with that lens, the first question is, well, who's the customer? In this case, our primary customer was developers across multiple cohorts of different size, different capabilities, and different motivations. We recognize that broadcasters and viewers are important because they are the downstream customers of these developers. And we want to make sure whatever we build doesn't adversely impact them, but they're not the primary one. And it's really important too, if you have a pretty big audience, to cohort them. Because for example, we had developers who were hobbyists who maybe had some CS skills but had never built anything at scale, to AAA game developers who had built crazy things for millions of people and had a vast war chest to put towards it. But they would also be motivated very differently. Like a game developer, they want someone to come into their game. A hobbyist just wants to maybe help the one broadcaster of a channel that they like. And understanding that is really important. The next thing is looking at, okay, what are some of the problems? Now, I kind of summarized this, but the biggest problem that we saw, or really there were 2 big problems. One, extensions are really hard to design. They're this brand new kind of shared app experience where there's thousands of people at the same time interacting with the same app together. Trying to design really interesting experiences around that is really tough. But what makes it more tough is they're also very technically challenging to build, because you essentially have to build a web app that can scale to Twitch scale. And to kind of put this into perspective, I look at all the engineers that we reject in interviews because we don't believe that they can develop to Twitch scale. And yet now we're saying, hey, third-party developers, you guys get to do this too. So when we have to choose a problem to solve, well, I actually believe that helping them design better experiences is what we want to do. We realized we were better equipped to actually solve making it technically easier, because there were things that we could automate. And of course, how do we know this? We talked to people. I also did a deep analysis of our funnel where I was looking at where were the biggest leaks in it. And we actually saw that there was a lot of motivation to come through the different stages. But as soon as someone started building an extension, they just dropped off. Or that's where the biggest amount of project abandonment was. Now, if we think about, well, what would be the biggest benefit? Well, if we can drive down the development cost and drive down the iteration time and drive down the opportunity cost, what we've unlocked for developers is more time for them to focus on delivering a great user experience. And our hypothesis is that by delivering a great user experience, they will, 1, get broadcasters to want to install us on their channel, which helped drove one of our metrics. They would also incent viewers to want to interact and potentially spend money in these extensions. And again, it's all about how do you kind of figure out what is your highest leverage opportunity and where you can get the most good out of it. And then finally, what is the customer experience? And this kind of coalesced into a vision 2 years out of this kind of integrated experience across scaling services, potentially built on top of AWS, and what I like to call the unity of developer tools, where a developer just got one tool they got in and they were focused on designing and building a great experience, and we just took care of the rest. And based out of that, we kind of had 2 work streams that emerged from the document. One is what we call scaling solutions, which we won't talk about, and the other is what we call the rig. So one of the things I like to talk about each phase is the things that I wish I knew and the things that I would have done differently throughout this process. Because while hindsight is 20/20, hopefully you can learn from some of the lessons that I learned during this process. The first is that working backwards takes such a long time to do. Way more time than you think, but it's absolutely worth it. I think I budgeted like maybe a day or two with my team to work on it, and then I worked on the document. Honestly, you should spend a week. And the great thing too is this is something you can do regardless of where you are. Even if you're not working in a product role right now, just take a space and actually apply this process to it. There's a bunch of templates online you can look at. It will absolutely up-level your capabilities as a product manager. The other one is share, share, share. One of the big benefits of doing working backwards with your whole team is you get to have folks bought in. So you're not having to spend all your time convincing all of your internal stakeholders to actually get this stuff done. One thing where I made a mistake here was I had my eng team and I had some of the other product managers, but I neglected to include marketing. I neglected to include design. And then I had to essentially spend a bunch of time afterwards getting them on the same page and getting them on board. Having a document helps, but you don't want to be sending documents all over the place. Make sense? Okay, let's talk about the next phase, which is product discovery. So the desired outcome here, again, is getting as much feedback as you possibly can about your product to test your hypotheses before your devs write code, or at least write a lot of code. This is so important. Now, the quote down here is from a book called Inspired by Marty Kagan. If you want to be a product manager, or if you are a product manager, you have to read this. If you take away anything from this talk at all, it should be that you're going to buy this book right now. Like, I don't get a kickback, I just think this book is freaking awesome. But anyways, what he talks about is that software projects can be really thought of as having two parts. There's figuring out what to build, which is product discovery, and then actually building it. And where I think products fail the most is there's not enough time spent in product discovery, and you only actually learn whether you built the right thing or not after you ship it to customers. And that's a really, really expensive way to learn. And and while that's often done in a lot of companies still, a way to up-level yourself and kind of distinguish yourself is building really, really strong skills with product discovery. So what does that actually mean in practice? So there's a lot of different things you can do. It could be as simple as adding experiments to an existing product or doing multivariate testing. It could be building a design prototype of a product that you're thinking of and actually getting it in front of customers. And not only testing their comprehension of it, but also testing whether it actually meets their value prop. In our case, since we're building a product for developers, we had a slightly different challenge. Because the technical design of the product mattered as much as what the product was actually doing, we needed a way to validate it with a more technical audience. So one of the things we started doing at Twitch is what we call RFCs, or requests for comment. So after we distilled down the working backwards vision, I had kind of my prioritized set of things that I wanted to build and the kind of important scenarios. I kind of did a light PRD on these, so kind of think about the problem more. And then I worked with the developer to actually build this document and post it on our forums. And what was helpful about it is, one, we got a lot of folks to read it, so we saw folks in our community were interested in this. That's one good thing. It also gave them an opportunity to comment and give us feedback about what we were doing. The comments were interesting because, one, they were like, hey, I like this, or hey, I don't like this, so it helps kind of adjust your priority. But more importantly, they actually called out things that were further down our roadmap and provoked some interesting questions about whether we would change that priority down the line. Now, the thing too is, with product discovery, I think I like to add into it too is what I call technical discovery. Because while you can, as a product manager, figure out what the value prop is going to be, test it with users, make sure you're developing a good user experience, how the product is built has a huge impact on that. And so the feasibility of your different options is going to be really, really important. So having your developers working on that during this phase of the process is something that's very, very useful. Which is also why it's really useful if you can run any kinds of lightweight experiments without actually pushing the product out fully. It's a great way to get that data. Now with this, we got some good data. We, full steam ahead on kind of our core scenarios, but there's a few things that we didn't do. And these are things that, these are some of the biggest lessons. The first thing we didn't do is we were pretty constrained by design resources at this point. So I was only able to get some initial mocks that we put into the RFC. But what we didn't do is UX prototype testing with customers. And this totally burned us later on because let's just say there were a bunch of user experience mismatches in the product that didn't really rear their ugly head until months later, and we could have totally caught them at the early phase before they were actually in customers' hands. The next thing too is really being thoughtful about what kind of customers you choose. While we had the whole developer community and just kind of thrust this thing onto ether and said, hey guys, what do you think? A more thoughtful way of doing this is actually picking a very limited set of what I call reference customers. Folks who are in the target demographics that you're trying to hit and who've agreed to not only just try out your product, but to actually give you feedback on a more regular cadence. So what would have been smart is we built a UX prototype, we had our reference customers, and we went back and forth with them for a while. Because one of the things I've learned when you do this, it's actually not the first questions that you're asking your audience, it's actually the follow-ups that get provoked. And that's when you start to get the real insights about what you should be doing or what you should not be doing. Okay, now let's get to the part where you actually start building stuff. This is the MVP and kind of scoping phase. Really the outcome you're trying to drive here is scope as much as possible so you can get an MVP or a minimum viable product into a customer's hands as soon as you possibly can. And this is what I struggle with because on one hand, as a product manager, you have a lot of empathy for your customers. You want to solve their problems. You want to make them feel good and deliver a great experience. And there's all these things you want to put in because it's going to be so great. But you have to be so ruthless. You have to be like a straight up murderer to your backlog. And you have to cut as much as possible. Otherwise, you'll just be developing forever. And then you'll actually never get anything in customers' hands. What's fun about this too is, and product managers in the room can probably relate to this, is actually where a lot of the decisions are made on the product. Like you may write a product requirements document, you may write a vision document, but it's really when you actually get down to the trenches and start building it that all these questions start being brought up. When you're working with design and have to make a couple very, very minor decisions, or what seem like minor decisions, or the choice of technology will impact your timeline by this or this, or hey, crap, Greg, we just saw that this is going to push us back by 2 weeks. Do we need to have this in here still? And it's on the day-to-day, this is one of the most fun times because it's really where you start to shape and get a better picture of what the product is. And especially when you can start using it yourself and start using it end-to-end is one of the most satisfying experiences possible. One thing that I found really useful is I actually like to spec even more than I know is going to be in the MVP, like even if I know I'm going to cut stuff, because doing that gives you a lot more context of the overall user journey, and it lets you know, like, okay, what really can get cut? Because no matter what, you will cut stuff, and if you just write the bare minimum initially, well, you're going to cut that stuff, and that's definitely a hard thing to go back from. And the other thing too is your relationship with engineers as a product manager is so critical. I can't underline that enough. If they haven't been involved in the process earlier, like if their first time like seeing this is reading your spec review, like that's not a good thing. But especially during this phase, you want to be as like meshed with them as possible. This is not something where you just show up at stand up, hear what they're doing, and leave. Like you want to be sitting at their desks with them. You want to be asking them questions because while you said this is what the product should be, they're the ones actually making what the product is. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who decide that stuff. So it's important to be working with them.
When you talk about spec, are you getting like a technical spec?
Yeah, that's a great question about specs. So there's different terminology that's used. There's really kind of two broad sets. The first is what one could call the product spec or the product requirements documents, or sometimes people write one-pagers. Basically, that's you deciding, okay, what is the feature set, what's the user experience, what's the value problem, what's the priority. Like that's basically your job as the product manager. And then oftentimes, your dev team will be writing the technical spec, which is how do we actually build this thing? I've been in some places where you write the product spec, you hand it to the devs, they write the technical spec. I don't like that very much because one, that shows me that the dev team, the product team is not communicating very well. There's a kind of a throw it over the wall mentality. The other thing too is like devs will also be much more interested in the product outcomes if they are part of deciding what those are going to be. So I actually like to do them both at the same time. So oftentimes nowadays I'll be working with my dev team on the product spec, like hand in hand. Because oftentimes they'll have really, really thoughtful ideas about what we should be doing. And just as like to take a step back, when I think about what the role of a product manager is, your job is not to be like the Steve Jobs and like, force everyone to your will. Like that's bullshit. Like your job is to figure out how to build the best product that will help customers. And like your job should be figuring out where those ideas should come from and how do you find the best idea. And it does not have to be your idea, and oftentimes it will not be your idea. It's all about how do you ask the right questions. Okay. Back in now. So MVP and scoping. So this is a quick mock that our designer did. We didn't have very much time of what like this MVP of the rig would look like. It's very, very simple, but it kind of hit on the two main scenarios that we distilled down. The first was how do I test extensions across all these different views and roles and things that I have to think about, and how do I do them at the same time to kind of create that shared experience. So here with a very, very simple web app with what we call the Brady Bunch view, it's over a channel page, you can get some output logs, and basically you can edit the context a little bit. There's a little bit more to it with what we shipped, but after iterating on it a bunch, our goal was to keep this as simple as possible and just focus on the scenario. The other thing too is we recognized that developers struggled a lot to actually get started. There's a bunch of things you have to set up on your machine. Like, how do you do it? How do you get to hello world? Like, how do you get that first kind of dopamine hit that you're actually making progress on something? So the other thing we prioritized with is what we call fast start, which involves some experiences in the rig as well as a sample that I ended up having another partner team build for us. And that was actually a very useful learning because things that we could have done during this phase. One, I should have been more ruthless. I talk about being a murderer, and I was not. I added a feature about logging that was totally superfluous. It only took a few days, but at this point, you want to be spending as much time as possible getting the core scenario as great as you can. The next thing too is, and I'll underline this again, is the choices the developer makes are going to have a massive impact and how the thing is built. Yeah, what's up?
Can we go back to the previous slide?
Yeah, sure.
And I hope this isn't a dumb question. I'm just not. So what would the MVP actually be?
You'll see a picture of it later, actually, with what the final one was. But basically, this is a web application that a developer would install on their computer. They would boot up in the browser, and then they would interact with it from the command line because it's a developer tool. And basically, in these boxes is where the extension would actually pop up as they were developing it. And they could dynamically change what's actually showing up in there to actually create their test environment, if that makes sense. Other thing, so the technical choices that developers make have a huge, huge impact. In this case, we kind of evaluated delivering this product in 3 different ways as our MVP. One was we built it directly into Twitch itself, into our core website. Another one is that we built it as a standalone application, kind of wrapped in like Electron or something. And then the third one was that we just kind of ship it as kind of a bundle of scripts and HTML and CSS on GitHub. And after evaluating those options, we actually ended up going with the third one because at that point, our evaluation of the other two was that it would take at least another month or two to properly do that. And again, the goal is to get something in customers' hands as fast as possible to validate the scenarios. That being said, the choices that were made, we definitely felt the pain of that. And if I could have actually gone and done this again, I would not have done this choice at all. I would have actually delayed this thing if I had known what kind of debt we would have been tacking onto ourselves. And I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into technical debt decisions in the product process, but there's always going to be a tension when you're developing something about, okay, I can cut a corner and get this out the door, but this is going to add, let's say, a month of tech debt to us in the future. And it's like a credit card. It just keeps adding on to itself. And suddenly you're a year in, you're like, oh shit, we can't do anything because all of our systems are super crufty because we did all these nasty hacks. But at the same time, you can't always go and build the perfect thing from an engineering perspective because that's going to take too long. And this is where it goes back to it's really important having a technical background or having some fluency there because these are conversations you're going to have with the engineering team and your engineering counterpart. And being able to navigate and negotiate that is going to be super important. Anyways, the last thing, so the sample we had built, I was working with the partner team. I would check in with them, every few weeks to see how it was going. Yeah, things were fine, and then it just never came. It never arrived. And when it did, it was completely wrong and broken. And the thing I wish I had known to do, and this is something that I do now, is really think about setting tripwires with partner teams, especially when you have a dependency. In this case, what I should have done is I should have been escalating up this person's manager chain to make sure that they were delivering the commitment that they had made. Because no matter what, whether they deliver this or not, my ass was on the line for getting this whole thing out the door. And that's, as a product manager, that's part of the fun is that, you get to enjoy and celebrate the team's success, but when things go wrong, it's on you. And at that point, you have to make sure that you're holding other people accountable to get these things done. Otherwise, you're going to be left holding the bag. Okay, let's talk about GotoMarket. So again, the desired outcome is getting the MVP into customers' hands, and most importantly, with an ability to measure the impact. When I was at Microsoft, we used to just ship stuff, and there was really no good way to measure it. And basically, we would look on Reddit to see, hey, did people like this or not? To be fair, it was a little bit more scientific than that. But it's so critical that not only have you defined metrics that measure success, but you actually have a way to measure that. This is where I'll do a quick interlude on input and output metrics. This is something we actually do at Twitch, and I love it. I've actually started to adopt this in my own life because I think this is such a cool concept. So an output metric is something that you want to happen. So here's an example. Let's say my output metric is I want to lose weight. Now, that is not something that I can just directly influence that myself. I can do a lot of things that I hope will cause me to lose weight. Now, an input metric would be the number of times that I go to a gym, like per week. And that's something I can directly measure. It's something I can directly control. So I can say, hey, I'm gonna go 3 times a week, and then later on I can measure, hey, did me going to the gym actually influence this output metric? And this is actually a really useful thing to have as a product manager because one, the output metric helps you actually measure like a customer outcome. That's really important. For example, the output metric I was driving is the number of extensions that were launched by developers during the year. Like there was some target I was going for. Now I could have said, hey dev team, let's just build extensions, but that would have been really stupid. So my input metric in this case was, hey, we see all these points of friction in the developer funnel where folks are falling out. I identified like 16 of them. And my input is like, okay, I'm going to address these 16 during this year, and that's how I'm going to focus my priorities. So in this case, the metrics that I'm choosing now are, I'm measuring obviously the downstream impact, I'm measuring whether we actually thought we solved this point of friction, and I'm doing this by looking at the adoption of the product, I'm looking at engagement, I'm looking at retention, and then I'm really most importantly looking at are folks actually stepping deeper into the developer funnel. So with this, what we ended up doing was launching the product during GDC, or the Game Developer Conference. At this point, the reason why I chose to do this was there was a ton of marketing dollars being spent. I figured it was a developer audience. It was a good way to engage with folks directly and get real feedback. And ultimately, the product that we shipped looked a little bit like this. Pretend this is in a web browser, where you had some really simple stuff. You could look at the different views. You could have multiple ones side by side. It was a very, very simple Hello World app. And honestly, like looking at it now and compared to what the rig looks like now, it's a little jank. But the important thing here is it was the most stripped down thing we could do that we knew would solve the developer's problem. Now, with this, because we were shipping on a date and we had to kind of pick this date months in advance, it was kind of a thumb in the air to be like, hey, are we actually gonna hit this? We're like, yeah, we'll do it. Let's be aggressive. Don't do that. Like I had this dream of, I'm gonna live announce this product on stage and it's just gonna come up magically and people can download it. Never do that. That was so stupid for a number of reasons. One, I was stuck on a public date that I couldn't move because I can be like, hey Amazon, can you just like move GDC like an extra day? Like that'd be great. And also, by setting a fixed date, we basically had to compress our development schedule to fit in that. Like, there was no way for us to not ship something. And as a result, certain parts of the product process, especially during GoToMarket, like testing, really kind of went by the wayside. And I ended up being, the night before, with my developers, like frantically cranking through additional integration tests and acceptance tests to make sure that what we were going to put in developers' hands the next day didn't totally suck. Don't do that. I hate date-driven shipping. The other big thing, and this actually was a big decision, is choosing our release vehicle. Remember I talked about like how, is this an app, is this like a bunch of scripts, is this on a website? That's part of it, but it's also like, what is the customer journey of how they acquire it? Like, where does someone go to get this? And in this case, we made the decision to actually release this as an open source project. And the kind of hypothesis behind this was we'd observed that our developer community often would work on projects together, share code, help each other out. And much like how extensions was meant to multiply the value of Twitch, I thought, hey, I can use the community to multiply the value of the rig. Like they can solve their own problems. This is freaking awesome. So we ended up releasing it as an open source project. The trade-off, though, was that it severely impacted our ability to instrument the product and what we could measure. Now, I could instrument enough stuff on our services to look at my broad metrics, like adoption, engagement, and retention, but we were unable to actually look more granularly at the user experience. And remember how I talked about earlier about not UX testing the prototype? Yeah, you combine these two things together and you're going to start to see what would come for us later on. So again, yeah, data-driven shipping sucks. Don't do it. Also, if I could do a trade-off again between open sourcing and then or getting data, I think open source is awesome. I don't think I'm going to do it again for a product like this because your ability to control what is going wrong and understanding what is going wrong is so important. And if you trade that away, then you're just kind of waiting for secondhand or third-hand information to get to you about your problems. And unless you have a very, very vibrant community that's going to talk to you, like you're not going to find out. You're going to find out because customers just stop using the product. And the last thing, yeah, again, testing is the thing that is always cut. But when you're building out your schedules for what you want to deliver, like really add extra time for this, and not just test internally, test externally. Get yourself a small flight group of like a few customers, maybe these reference customers that you set up beforehand, because they're going to be your best friends, because they're going to find stuff that you did not find and what your devs did not find. Okay, so now this is where I think it's really fun to become a product manager, because you have a product in market, customers are using it, and you're getting data. And really, this is where you get the data, you examine your metrics, you're like, hey, have I hit my input metrics? How am I trending towards my output metrics? What is the product health that I have? And then you make your next decision, like, what are you going to build next? Is it going to be something where you decide to fix bugs, or you have to pivot the core value, you have to change the core value prop of the product because it didn't stick? Is this something where like, hey, we think we're doing well, but we have these gaps that we have to address with additional features? Or it's like, shit, we locked on this thing, let's pour some fuel on the fire, like this is awesome. But again, the thing you're going to want to do here is really look at all the data that you have, not just quantitative data. You actually want to get back out and talk to customers, because data can often lie to you, especially when you want it to be good. Now, in this case, for us, the quantitative data was freaking awesome initially. So within 2 weeks, we had 60% of our active developer audience using this product. And not only that, they were using it a ton. I was able to track basically every time they were running one of their tests or booting it up, and they were doing it hundreds of times a day. So we realized we had scratched an itch that they desperately had, and that we had something that not only solved the problem, but it was something they were using every day, which opens up a huge opportunity for us to add value to them across the entire process. Because not only can we, get them something that where they're using it, but there's a way for us to nurture them and help them through other parts. So, but here's the thing I didn't do. I didn't, again, talk to some of the customers directly to understand what their UX problems were. I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, I know there's some cruft here, but it seems fine. People seem to get past it, like they're using it a ton. And at this point too, as we're looking at the rest of the developer funnel, we saw that higher up, there was a point that was bleeding a lot of users where we had this kind of nasty onboarding process that folks had to go through before they could even start building extensions. And while we're like, yes, we should fix that, there's a bunch of policy and compliance stuff that we had to get through, so that was going to take a while. So then we had this idea of, hey, let's use the rig. Let's find a way to let people just start building extensions in the rig without all the rest of the Twitch stuff. They'll start building, they'll get excited, and then they'll be more willing to go through this painful process. Like, let's just pour fuel on the fire and get more users in there. So with that, we ended up building a feature that we called local mode, which did this. And I talk about the date-driven shipping is dumb. Well, guess what? I signed myself up for that again, because I apparently didn't learn my lesson the first time. The cool thing at this point was we had other product managers in the team actually building features in the rig itself. So we were, going to accomplish our vision, but this now meant that we were tied to their schedules, not our own. And we ended up delivering something probably faster than we should have. And this is where it went very, very wrong. So, we launched the product, we see a bump up in our metrics again. In this case, our new user growth had lived and it was sustained. But then that's when we started working with customers. So that weekend, we were hosting a special hackathon at Twitch called Outside Hacks, and the rig was going to be a centerpiece of it for folks to use. And so I went, hoping to see what folks' reaction was to help them out maybe, and it was a disaster. So it turned out that our early audience of developers was very, very tolerant of some of the poor UX decisions that were in there. Like extremely tolerant, and they were willing to walk through fire basically to use this product. Turned out the rest of the audience was not. I think I spent the entire time trying to help people get their computers to actually work with this thing. And a lot of it stemmed too from the the technical decisions we made, because you had to install a bunch of software to make it work, which normally for devs, that's not that big of a deal. But if anyone has done web dev work, their computers are so freaking weird. There's like all these crazy configurations that you just can't account for. And while we had tested it a ton internally, we tested it with the way our stuff is configured, not all their stuff. And so it created this problem where folks desperately wanted to use it. They was we want to use this, but we can't. And as someone again who cares so much about the customer, it is the most painful thing to see, where you're literally trying to help someone and you're making their life shittier. So, so the learning here for this first one is, first of all, like, we thought we had great engagement, but we weren't asking all the questions. And that's what you should do, is always be super diligent and pursue all forms of truth that you can around your product, because at least some of it is going to be lying to you. It could be a customer not telling you what their problem really is, or it could be a data that is just indicating something entirely different. And again, like emphasizing the need when you're launching products, especially if it's a net new product that's not built on top of anything and you can't do any experimentation, like get yourself that core user testing group and iterate for a couple weeks. So at least a product is in some people's hands, but you'll often find a lot of your problems will go away after that. Okay, so we've had our first iteration. We thought things were going great. We thought we were expanding. Now we're in the, oh shit, we need to fix this moment. And I hope you don't end up in this situation too often in your careers, but invariably you're going to ship something that is going to break and you have to do something immediately. And what's different about this part of the product process is there is a lot more need to move very fast. So the biggest thing you want to do, address the symptoms quickly, solve the underlying issue. And the important thing here is structuring and triaging the problem. Like, what are the biggest fires? What is the fastest thing you can fix? What is the way that we can be accountable to customers? And like, again, as the PM, you have to own this, and you have to stand out there in front of your customers and own it, because that is the most important way for them to trust that you're actually going to solve their problems again. And the other thing you want to do is really define metrics around what that big problem is and actually measure where you fix them. In our case, our problem was the onboarding issue, and it actually was broken down into 3 main pieces. There was a software problem, there was how people actually got the rig set up and working, and then how they actually kicked off testing the extension. There were 3 separate problems. Now, the first one we thought we could solve relatively easily, but the other 2 were going to be a lot harder. This is also where we ran into the lovely problem of technical debt. So remember how I told you about the credit card that we kept swiping during the year? Well, this one came back to bite us in the ass, because basically our services couldn't handle the rig using them for part of our lifecycle process. So, I ended up having to design an experience that totally just kind of like try to work around it, but it ultimately did not work very well. One of the things that we learned too in this is, initially we're like, hey, let's solve the problem of all this weird software stuff. So we're like, okay, we'll write a script. So, users click a button and it will just work. We'll intelligently solve their problems. Like, we've tested a bunch now, we'll figure it out. Well, it turned out that we did too good of a job in some ways, in that we covered it all for the customer, but there was still like a 20% group that still had problems, but they didn't know what went wrong because we covered it up for them. So we ended up having to backtrack a little bit. So the lesson here is be really thoughtful about how much you're reacting to solving a problem and whether you're actually creating new ones for yourself. The other piece too, and I won't go into this too much, is at this point we didn't have a designer anymore because the designer we had on this project just like left the company. So at that point I was a designer. Because as a PM, your job is to build a product and get it out the door, whatever means possible. As a lesson, like, action is not always the best approach. Honestly, like, while we were able to ship an update, we were able to correct some of these problems, the one thing we didn't correct was perception. This was both internal and external. Now, if we had a designer working on it and we were able to deliver a polished, user experience, that would have been one thing. But it was like Greg's janky ass, design working with a dev to build it. So then the issue was, for folks who had a bad experience in the rig still looked broken, even if it wasn't broken. And also to my internal stakeholders, the rig also looked broken, even if it wasn't broken. So suddenly I'm having to contend not only with external perception, but how to manage internal stakeholders to make sure we can still fund this project. The other things to think about here too are, again, making sure when you're going to solve a problem, like, it is good sometimes to tackle the symptoms in the short term if there's a really quick fix you can do to help relieve some developer or customer pain. But if you aren't actually solving the problem and kicking the can down the road, it's just going to keep coming back more in full. And then again, the last thing is external customers are obviously super important. You have to focus on them, but do not neglect your internal stakeholders. Like, include them as part of this process so they can understand your thinking behind it, what you're going to do, and then they have proper expectations about what is going to be delivered. Okay, last one. So the final iteration is what I like to call the do the right thing and rebuild customer trust. So kind of in this scenario, we shipped a product that was broken, we kind of fixed it, but there's still a lot of kind of hesitance from our community we were still getting users, but we were still, anecdotally hearing from folks who used to use this product, like, yeah, I'm not gonna use this anymore, this thing sucks. Even though we had actually fixed a lot of it. So really the thing you wanna get here is, in this scenario, is how do you actually rebuild customer trust? This is one of the hardest things to do as a product manager because you're not starting, from zero where a customer doesn't know you. Like, you have injured them in some way and you have to now make good on that. The first thing you should think about here is look inside first because, much like how, I try to go it alone in the previous release and do a lot of things myself, that's not the way to do it. Like, there are other people at the company who care as much about the customers as you do, and they're gonna wanna solve these problems too. So I'd first recommend finding like your Avengers Assemble moment and find a bunch of cross-functional folks who can actually join up with you. In this case, we had a new designer named Camille who joined, and then a dev named Chris who joined, and they were like two of the all-stars that actually helped this turnaround. The other thing too is you can't just lightly iterate on the product. You have to like dramatically pivot something to reframe customer expectations. Again, you still have to be super accountable to your customers. Like, as much as it sucks to have to get up there and kind of take punches, like, ultimately they'll respect you more for doing that, and your team will also respect you more for that. One of the things that I've learned is you never, like, if anyone gets thrown under the bus, it should be you. Like, you never want to do that to your team because their trust in you is just as important as customers trusting you. And then the last thing too is, in this case, you have to be a little bit more cautious in what you bring to market. And really, really be thoughtful about your messaging, which makes sense. So in this case, we had a couple interesting problems. So given that internal perception was bad at this point, my management at the time was talking about actually just pulling the plug on this thing and saying, hey, like, we shouldn't invest in this anymore. Like, this is broken. We should put our resources elsewhere. There were also other folks in our org at the time who had alternatives that they were pushing which would benefit their team. So the first thing we had to do was really reframe what our leadership was thinking. We accomplished this in two ways. The first is I got my developer, Chris, really, really excited about a different framework called Electron, which basically, it's pretty useful. Like, if you guys ever use Slack, like, that's an Electron app, basically, where it's essentially a wrapper around a web app that you can install on your machine. And you install it just like an installer. And we weren't sure originally about what it would take to integrate it, but I got Chris really excited, and then over Thanksgiving, he just did it. And I came back, like, it was like a Thanksgiving miracle, basically. And at the same time, Camille, as you can see, the design looks very, very different than what I would call the Jank-ass style. And we were able now to put those things together and actually get in front of our internal stakeholders, even though the product wasn't done. And with those two things, it wasn't that, oh, this is the rig, this is a totally different product. We even called it something different. We called it the native rig, which was kind of bullshit because it was the same thing. There were some hard choices that we had to make. One of the ones is we didn't want to ship this as open source because if we were going to take another shot at this, we had to make sure we were doing the right thing. So we still had the open source version that was still kind of out there. People were kind of contributing to it, but we were kind of, like, we actually forked it to build this. So it was still the rig, but we were doing this in secret in our own branch because we did not want customers to know that we were doing this until we were ready to show it to them. Like, we'd been burned by pushing stuff out the door too early and trying to be transparent. And in this case, well, we need to have a different kind of transparency. So what actually helped, and this helped with the open source decision, is we actually finally got that great group of reference customers. And the way I chose these people is half of them actually, I picked ones who hated the rig and were like major detractors in the community. I got them all together into like a Discord chat and was like, hey guys, like, this is what we're doing. We've heard all these things and you guys are our customers and we want to work together with you. Like, this is our product to make this great. And one, by trusting in them and showing them how much we guided them, that really helped start to rebuild our relationship. And it turned out this was one of the best things we did in the process because we were able to ship builds like 2 to 3 times a week to them and rapidly iterate and get that feedback that this product had desperately needed the whole time. So by the time we eventually showed it to customers, it was in a very different state. So yeah, part of this internal demo thing that we did was to buy ourselves runway because I was like, look, we're not going to commit to any dates on this. Or I said, like, well, at least work on it until, like March or something. But like, we're going to do this the right way, but we need the runway to do this. And so we ended up, I'll talk about when we kind of released or how we did it in a second. But yeah, getting ourselves a runway to actually do it right was huge. And kind of eliminating distractions from the folks that were working on it too was really important. So let me answer the question now about open source. So part of what gives the confidence to get rid of the open source piece is actually a bunch of these developers in our special group had contributed to the open source. And they would probably be the ones who were most upset about, why we get rid of it. And so we actually just had a very honest conversation with them in the NDA Discord about what we were doing. And they're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I care more about that this thing solves my problems than, whether I can, be famous on your GitHub. But again, because we had rebuilt trust with them and we were just honest with them, that made the difference. And like, honestly, when we did a broader announce of it, I was really worried that people were going to flip out. But it actually turned out to be really cool. People were like, yeah, that's like actually really reasonable. And I think like if you treat customers like as reasonable human beings, even though it sometimes feels like they don't act that way, it actually really helps. Now, so we iterated on this thing a ton. As you can see, it looks very, very different. Now, the last kind of big piece of this is how do we then get it out more broadly? We'd burned by releasing things too early. And so I knew whatever we did, it had to be a beta. It had to be a way that was controlled, that we could slowly grow our set of customers. And people had to want to do it. I couldn't just be like, hey, here's the rig, go do it, because, well, there was a perception problem. So one of the things we use to our advantage is at Twitch, we have a monthly stream, because we're a live streaming platform, to all of our developers that I had appeared on a bunch of times. I talked about the rig. We had a catchphrase called "Get Riggy with it." Like, it was really meant to have folks feel ownership. And in this case, I went on the December one. You can see me in the upper corner there during split screen. I think I ate a burrito on screen. I don't know why I did that. But in this case, it was an opportunity to do something bold to actually reframe expectations. So first I said, hey, I want to share something we've been working on. It's the rig. And everyone's like, that's bullshit. The rig sucks, blah, blah, blah. And if you've ever been in Twitch chat, you will totally understand what I'm talking about. A lot of penis emojis. But what I said is like, well, no, look, like, we heard all of your problems, and here are the things you told us. And I listed out all the biggest pain points. And I said, okay, well, here's how we fix them. And they're like, okay, we're kind of interested. I'm like, I'm going to prove it to you. And I said, okay, everyone, get your phones out or your timers out. Like, I'm actually going to, from not even having this on my machine at all, install it, open it up, and actually go deep into the program, which would have taken a lot longer earlier. And I'm like, okay, give me an estimate. Like, what do you think it's going to be? And everyone's like, like 20 minutes, it's going to be an hour, we're going to be here forever. And I just did it live. And where this was an interesting, it took like less than a minute to get all the way in. And what was important about this was kind of a surprise. And they're like, oh shit, this thing actually works. And then I immediately followed it with, and all you in the stream, just you right now, get to be part of our private beta to make it better. And so I was able to quickly flip their perceptions and actually make them part of our community again and want to help. Now, this was a bit of a risky move because if the demo went badly, as live demos often do, I would have been toast. Like, no one would have ever trusted us again, even with the folks in our community. But that being said, when you're trying to drag yourself back out, you just kind of have to go for it. Again, if the worst case was it doesn't work out, we maybe shelve the project or we release it later on and we move on with our lives. But again, your job is to deliver the best results that you possibly can, and sometimes there's where caution is well advised, like holding it back to a very small audience, and other times you just kind of have to go for it. And again, things I wish I would have learned. Again, beta group, freaking awesome, definitely do that. And then the other one too is I should have done a better job earlier of questioning the technical decisions that my developers have made. And this is one of those things where trust is really, really important. I think if I questioned them earlier, we probably could have pivoted to this maybe 6 months beforehand. But I didn't ask that question. So always be asking questions. So with that, what are the final takeaways for this? I guess we're not going to have final takeaways. Okay, now we will. Okay, so, well, first of all, read Inspired by Marty Kagan. It's an incredible book. It will make your lives better. But now, what are some big things to think about here for your own product career? First of all, always start with your customer and work backwards. Don't work forwards, work backwards. Validate as much as you possibly can before you start writing code. The experiences, the design, the tech, the value prop, and make sure you can have a conversation about this. Be relentless in your pursuit of the truth. Data in isolation can lie to you. You need to have it together to see the full picture. Shipping is ultimately about learning, and it's how you apply those learnings to improve outcomes for customers. So make sure what you're shipping you can measure, and you can actually prove whether you've done something or not. This is not a 1 p.m. show. When we had the most success was when we were all working as a team together and everyone in their roles was able to be the most successful. And make sure people are bought in. And then the last one is be stubborn, be relentless. People sometimes describe being a PM as being like the CEO or an entrepreneur, and It's a little bit self-serving, honestly, but like they're kind of right, because it's up to you, honestly, to make sure this thing gets out the door, this thing is successful, and the amount of determination that you have will be a big factor in how far you can push. And that honestly is a way to get folks to follow you and do it.